Hey everyone, welcome to 1105 Making History. I am Fred Gibbs, Associate Professor in the History Department. I just wanted to take a few minutes to say hello and to introduce the class so you have some idea of what you're getting yourself into. I think this is going to be a super fun class. I'm going to do two videos. I'm going to do a sort of intro to the class and kind of the topics we cover and why I think it's important. And there's going to be another video, another short one, hopefully, that goes over the course syllabus and logistics and assignments and that sort of stuff. I think it's all very clear as it is, but sometimes it's nice to have a few extra highlights and points of emphasis to keep in mind. If you haven't seen the syllabus, you can go to UNM Learn, where you will not find the syllabus because it's actually not embedded in Learn in any way, but you'll see a link to the syllabus. It's in my introductory announcement and also on the left nav bar. So you can find a link to the syllabus and it goes to fredgibbs.net, that's me, and you'll see the syllabus there. But I'll talk more about that in the other video. For now, I want to talk more about the class and what we're planning to do. This class is a survey about how history has been written over time. And it looks at what historians have been trying to do in their research and writing. It looks at why they thought it was important, what purpose they thought it served, and how they wrote about it. And most importantly, it looks at why all of these interpretations of the past have so constantly and radically changed, right? Historians have very different research methods now than they used to. They use very different kinds of sources. They're aware of other things happening in the world that historians didn't used to think were important. History is done very differently than it was even 50 years ago, but even 30 years ago, 10 years ago. It's constantly changing. And that is, I think, something interesting in itself and an important way of understanding what history is about. One point about terminology is very important here. People use history and the past interchangeably, right? We do this all the time. You're going to read about this a little this week if you haven't already. We need to differentiate those terms right away in this class. The past is stuff that happened, right? People have done things. There's been wars and great art, and things have happened. Okay. History, though, are the stories we tell about the past. History is a discussion about what the past means. So this class is much less concerned with the past than it is history as an ongoing conversation. Okay, so that's what we're studying. We're studying history, not the past. We're studying this ongoing conversation about the past. Okay, so a few words about history, not the past, as we get underway, particularly why I think history and the study of history, historiography it's sometimes called, we'll get into that next week, why I think it's so important and so interesting. And it's not that I think my opinion's all that valuable, but as the instructor, I think it's nice for you to know where I'm coming from. If you ask most people what history is about, I think you're going to get some kind of reply that history is researching and writing about what happened in the past. That's pretty uncontroversial, I would think. So, fair enough. If you ask why it's useful or why it's important, I think you'll get a much wider range of answers. Okay? A lot of people default to the idea that history is about learning lessons, right? You've all heard adages like, history repeats itself, or Mark Twain wrote that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. There's another adage, you may have heard George Santayana, an influential 20th century philosopher, poet, American thinker, in 1905 wrote that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So there's a lot of sentiment like that. I couldn't agree less with the statement that history is about learning lessons or learning what not to do or preventing some mistakes or avoiding something that went wrong. I don't think that's even really possible for reasons that we can get into later. So why is history interesting and useful? A couple things I want to say very quickly about this, because it really is kind of the foundation for how I've put the class together and why we do the things that we do. One, history, the study of history, the study of the conversations about the past, trains us to evaluate evidence in historical context. So I see history as indispensable to civic society. Anyone saying anything interesting about the world is synthesizing information. They're taking a lot of different inputs, data, experience, stories, whatever, and they're trying to say something new about it. right? That's the basic, process of knowledge production. And however that's done, there's a lot of methods, obviously. It's necessarily historical because you're gathering information that's happened in the past, and it happened in particular circumstances. Even if it's a very short history, even if it's a very short window of time in which information is being gathered, it still has a context that we have to understand. Studying the past gives us tools to make those determinations. It helps us to understand the different lenses that historians have used to analyze the past and to understand their motivations for writing about it. And it helps us to apply those lenses or those ways of thinking about the world that historians are trying to do to the present day. So it helps us understand where we are by looking at how people have tried to understand where people were in the past, if that makes any sense. Even scientific data produced in a lab under very controlled circumstances, right? It's model science. It's culturally determined. The people working in that lab come from a certain culture with a certain worldview and assumptions about how things work. Now, this isn't to say that all data is wrong because it's somehow culturally dependent, but we have to recognize that how experiments are set up, how things are measured, how we interpret those measurements, those depend on cultural circumstances, right? There's no objective data about the world waiting to be discovered. We make it, okay? This is what historians of science and medicine, I'm one of them, obviously. This is what we study, in my case, history of diet and health and food. So learning about history, again, as distinct from the past, battles and wars and kings and stuff, learning about history and how historians have analyzed the historical record differently over time is useful for any critical analysis. Okay, so that's one point. Another point, why is history interesting and useful? It helps us understand what it means to be human. And in this sense, history isn't meant to be some kind of feel-good enterprise, about how we're becoming more compassionate and sophisticated and enlightened and more technologically advanced and so on. Some histories love to do this, right? You've read books that sort of, oh, we're so great. That kind of history is, in a way, has fallen out of favor in favor of looking at contradictions and tensions, right? The irrationality and genius and frivolity, creativity, cruelty, empathy, depravity that humans are capable of. I mean, we are, as a species, pretty amazing because of all the weird stuff that we do to each other and to the world and so on. And all the stuff that we've made, right? There's good, there's bad. It's all of this stuff together. So how do we understand us? How do we understand humans? And I think there's a lot of disciplines that study people, right? Psychology, philosophy, ethnography. We go on and on. I think the most accurate portrayal of who we are, of what we are, really comes from looking at the historical record, because it is who we are, right? We made this stuff. We decided to keep it. We decided to ignore it. Studying how we've made those decisions, how we've interpreted what we've done later on, I think that tells us a lot about our nature, right? History shows us that paradoxes and tensions are a fundamental part of humanity, right? And this country is a perfect example, right? On one hand, land of economic opportunity, a haven for religious freedom in general, I suppose you could say, soaring ideals of liberty, equality, tremendous, scientific achievement. On the other hand, right, and at the same time, it's a place of displacement and dispossession and slavery and violence and discrimination and inequality, inequity. Right? It's all of these great things and it's all of these terrible things at the same time. Their histories are totally intertwined, right? History is the story about how all of these things intertwine and how we've tried to disentangle them and how we've tried to study them. And learning about history gives us way better tools intellectually for thinking about how do we interact with the world around us. For my last point, I want to return to the history cliche for a second. The famous Roman writer Cicero, most of you know him, wrote that to be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to forever remain a child. So what does that mean? I think it means that history provides an awareness and perspective of not just the past, which it obviously does, but more importantly, maybe the world around us. And it provides a way of understanding why things are the way they are, how they got that way, and crucially, how to affect change, right? If you want to change the world, you need to understand where it is and what forces have pushed it to where it is. Because if you don't understand those, you're not going to get very far in changing the directions, right? Historical distance, looking at the past, helps us to understand structures and influences that are really hard to see sort of in your own world, right? So the invisible hand of capitalism is one. We can look around and we know we live in a capitalistic society, and we can complain about it and we can sing its praises and so on and so forth. But to understand what capitalism entails, to understand the effect that it's had, you can't just look around, really. I mean, you can get some sense of it, but you really have to look historically. You need that distance, right? So something like capitalism is some structure that's affecting us every day. Systemic racism is another thing that we interact with, even if we don't want to or don't recognize it. It's something that affects us, and some people disproportionately more than others, obviously. We can't understand these things unless we see how they've developed historically. And we can't do anything about them unless we have that kind of awareness. So that historical distance I mentioned a second ago, that's what gives us unique perspectives, not just on the past, and just, we don't care why it happened just for its own sake of knowing it. We want to know why it happened so that we can do something with that knowledge. We can change the world around us. One thing that history doesn't give us is answers, okay? It's definitely not about repeating past mistakes. I don't think history has any utility when it comes to not repeating past mistakes, because history is full of us repeating past mistakes all the time, right? This is almost common sense, even though people still say, we're doomed to repeat the past if we don't learn about it. No, we're going to repeat the past anyways. It's going to be slightly different. There's other things, right? These other reasons I'm talking about are reasons why history is useful. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that there's never a right answer when it comes to understanding the past. History is not some body of knowledge that's constantly growing. I think that was a very popular way of thinking about it. It's a very positivist, empiricist approach. Knowledge of the past is just growing. History is this body of knowledge of, we learn more about people and places and things and battles and systems of economies, and we just keep learning more about the world, and it's great. It's really exciting. Knowledge is awesome. But that's not how history really is. It's not just this body of knowledge that's growing. It's like little bubbles of conversation that are moving through time. And people come in and out of the conversation. Ways of thinking become popular and less popular, right? It's just always in flux. There is no sort of set body of knowledge. We get to decide what knowledge is useful, what knowledge needs to be sort of refined or cultivated, what we should not talk about anymore, what we need to talk about and haven't been. It's an ongoing conversation, right? Again, history versus the past is a key distinction here. History is a debate about what happened and what the consequences were, and what kinds of questions we should be thinking about in terms of our own world, right? And how we can shape it. So history is constantly being rewritten and revised to fit the needs of the people who were writing it and reading it at that time, right? When you read history, even from let's just go back 100 years. It's 100 years in terms of history is not that long, right? I mean, granted, a lot has happened in the last 100 years, but the way history is written now compared to 100 years ago, and again, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, you can still see significant changes. But even if you go back 100 years, which is again not that long, it sounds just ludicrous, right? And you're like, how has history as a conversation changed so much? It's reflective of how much the world has changed. Okay, that's it for my little intro here. Another quick video will cover the syllabus, logistics, and how we get at these issues that I've been talking about as being so interesting and so important. Okay, talk to you later.